Hey everybody, it's Steve from Asian Boss. As many countries are getting ready to reopen their economies, you might be thinking that the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic is behind us. Well, think again. Since easing its strict social distancing restriction, South Korea has seen a significant increase in new virus cases again, and this will likely be repeated in other countries as well. As established by the medical community, we now have to come to terms with the fact that COVID-19 is here to stay. And the only hope of eradicating the virus is developing a vaccine. The problem is there are just way too many conspiracy theories about vaccines right now. So to fact check, we're back here at the International Vaccine Institute to see Dr. Jerome Kim. Dr. Kim is the head of the IVI and arguably the most eminent vaccine expert in the world. If you ever wanted to hear a true expert fact check the conspiracies surrounding vaccines, this is it. The only thing we'll ask you to do after watching the following interview is share it with everybody you know. People deserve to know the most accurate, science-based information. Let's get straight to it. Thank you so much for your time again.
My pleasure.
It's been roughly about a month since I last saw you. How you been?
Great, busy again, but lots of things are happening, and we're hopefully going to start the first vaccine trial for COVID-19 in Korea at the end of this month or the beginning of next month. So everyone's working around the clock.
A lot of things are happening.
And good things and bad things, right?
What were some of those things for you?
We saw the announcement that the Jenner vaccine protected monkeys against infection. And, Moderna making an announcement on the potential effect of their vaccine in human subjects. Their phase 1 study had 45 people. The announcement included only 8.
How do you feel about that?
It's a little bit frustrating. I mean, it's not, I guess, surprising because of the pressure that everyone's under with COVID, but it has immediate impact on stock markets and the price of Moderna stock, and and those are the kinds of things that cause people, I think, not to lose faith in science, because as soon as that appeared, some people said, "Oh, great, positive results, more suggestion that a vaccine may be possible." And other people looked at it and said, "Oh, are you kidding? It's just 8 people." And they said something this way, and we really don't understand what that means. They said, in the end, these 8 individuals developed what we call neutralizing antibodies, proteins that bind to and inactivate virus. Great. And they said, but they didn't tell us the level. They didn't say it was a very high titer of antibody. They said, similar to what's seen in people who have natural infection. That doesn't help, because there's a paper that some scientists from Shanghai did that said, well, in young people who have very minimal infection, they don't develop much not neutralizing antibody. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the Moderna vaccine actually makes protective responses that are similar to what we see in protected humans? Or is it that the levels were low? And it's difficult to put it in context because we actually haven't seen or been able to analyze the data. So
there are a lot of unanswered questions.
With Moderna, we haven't seen the preprint. We've just seen an announcement that was made at an investors meeting.
Oh.
So not to a scientific venue, but to people who've invested in Moderna stock. And
I feel like something going on there.
yeah, well, but it's useful information.
Right.
It's hopeful information, but we don't know more than that. We don't know if this was they looked at 8 people only, or maybe they looked at 8 out of 45, and the other 37 didn't have anything. So we don't have any additional information. So
there's no context.
Right, exactly.
Right. So were you guys almost like briefed, or like were you aware of the fact that this announcement was going to be made public?
So there was an odd statement, I think, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but Moncef Slaoui, who is the U.S. senior advisor for vaccines, for COVID-19, said something in his original briefing about, I've seen some of the data that are coming out and they look great. And then, I think a day or two later, this comes out. And it turns out that he was a shareholder in Moderna.
Okay.
And I understand Moderna's position. Once they have the data, it becomes something that could potentially have a really dramatic impact on their stock price. So I think they're actually required to disclose it. Actually, I think you're a lawyer by training, so you would know more of the disclosure rules than I do. But I think that if a company comes upon information that potentially impacts share prices, they have to disclose it. A lot of the information is getting out in a form that really doesn't allow us to adequately review it. So it's a little frustrating on the one hand. On the other hand, I mean, we're moving at the speed of light. We are moving very fast, and so there's a tremendous demand for information.
Right.
And unfortunately, at this point, a lot of it's unfiltered, not been through peer review.
I guess there has to be a compromise there somehow.
Right. And I don't think we found that magic point yet where everyone feels comfortable. And I think that can be confusing because people will hear one thing and then hear another. They'll hear someone else say, well, we're rushing through this. Maybe this isn't safe.
Yeah.
And then, so now there's some study that was reported in Reuters that actually a fair number of Americans would not take the vaccine when it first comes out.
Which kind of leads to the whole point of the second interview, I suppose. What's important is to, number one, establish your credibility in ways that people don't question what you say. And number two, even if you are the voice of reason, people may question, are you biased? Whether it be politically or by financial interest, whatever the case may be. I know we touched on this briefly last time, but if you could just explain to people why they should listen to you.
Let's see, so I was born in Hawaii, went to medical school at Yale. I took a scholarship from the Air Force. And in return, I was supposed to pay the Air Force back with 4 years of service. I applied for permission to do my training in internal medicine and infectious diseases at Duke University Medical Center in North Carolina. And I'm in the Air Force. I was assigned to go and work in the Army to work on HIV vaccine development. And I stayed in the military until 2015, working on an HIV vaccine.
How many years is that?
So that is a total of about 30 years working on vaccines, and a good portion of that, almost 20 years working on HIV vaccines.
So IVI, as far as I understand, is independent.
We're a nonprofit international organization funded by 3 countries. So international organizations like WHO or the United Nations have member states. So we have 35 member states and World Health Organization as signatories, and 3 countries, Korea, Sweden, and India, provide funding. And we heard in April that Finland will join as a signatory and a funder. So not a single G7 country. And they provide about a quarter of our funding. And the rest of our funding comes from grants. And today, the Gates Foundation is a bit under 40% of our grant funding. But now we have funding from Samsung, the European Union, the Wellcome Trust, the German government, project funding, and projects like science grants from the Korean government.
So that's why a lot of people might question, hold on, so we get that you're like a stand-up guy, but then the fact that you're getting funded by the Gates Foundation, is something going on there? Like, how do you respond to these, I suppose, accusations?
So actually, no one's ever asked us that question. I think people in countries around the world that receive the oral cholera vaccine are unbelievably grateful. I mean, when you think about cholera, for instance, the Western Hemisphere, the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, South America, cholera had largely been eliminated, and it was reintroduced last century. But for instance, the island of Haiti hadn't seen a case of cholera in over 100 years. And there was a horrible earthquake, and the UN sent peacekeepers to Haiti. And one of them was from a cholera endemic country, a country that has cholera. And that person accidentally introduced cholera into Haiti, where they'd never seen it before. And before you know it, there are hundreds of thousands of people infected, and 10,000 deaths, all in the space of a few weeks. And that's what cholera does. And the cholera vaccine wasn't ready at the time. But now when there are huge outbreaks in Yemen, or if there's a big cholera outbreak and I don't know that it will happen, I hope that it doesn't, but there was just a hurricane that hit Bangladesh. If there's a cholera outbreak there, it's actually the cholera vaccine that IVI helped to create that is entering, that will be used to control the outbreak. This cholera vaccine is really remarkable. Its actual efficacy is only between 50 and 60%. So that's if you compare the vaccine to nothing. But when you use it, actually use it in the real world, it has an effectiveness over 80%. And why is that? It's this herd effect that we've been talking about, that you've heard about with COVID. You know how when you reach a certain number of, either you vaccinate 70% of the people or 70% of the people have had COVID-19 infection, then the population will be protected. Well, actually, oral cholera vaccine does that too. It's created, I guess, we talk about social distance. In this case, it's immunological distance. The vaccine actually creates a protection for people who are both vaccinated and unvaccinated. And that was made possible with funding from Korea, India, Sweden, and the Gates Foundation. And it's no benefit. I mean, IVI doesn't benefit. The Gates Foundation receives no royalties. This was something that the world needed and that was developed. The other example might be a vaccine against the infection of the brain called meningitis. Again, it was a horrible problem in Africa. Killed hundreds of thousands of children. And there was a need for a vaccine. And so the Gates Foundation, working with an organization in Seattle called PATH, and with an Indian company, the Serum Institute, came up with a new meningitis vaccine, and it's dropped the rates of meningitis infection in Africa to almost undetectable. Again, no profit for the Gates Foundation, no profit for PATH. I mean, it's really a global good. The work that we used to do in the Army, so we used to joke, the Army used to work on all the diseases no one cared about, but that caused huge amounts of disease, death, illness in the developing world. And why was the Army interested in it? Well, we send soldiers to those places where there's dengue, where there's malaria. And so the Army had an interest in doing it. And really, for a long time, the Army had the predominant interest in vaccines for these diseases. And then around the year 2000, when Gates set up this foundation, they saw the need. And they've moved funding into these diseases that no one was willing to fund before.
As far as COVID-19 vaccines, are we still looking at that 18 months time frame, or has there been any unforeseen challenges that may delay the whole thing even more?
So far, we've been moving along at a faster pace than I've ever seen for any vaccine.
Wow.
And in the end, I think we'll have a vaccine. Maybe it's not going to be in 6 to 18 months, but we will have a vaccine, and in some time frame. But the bigger problems then, how are we going to make sure that we're going to be able to make enough at high enough quality, quickly enough? And then once we make it, how are we going to use it? Who's going to get it first? And these are going to be huge problems because the demand for the vaccine is going to be immediate. They're going to have to figure a way to train groups around the world and to transfer technology and have licensing agreements in place so that once the vaccine is approved, it can rapidly go into production.
Does IVI have any say in the whole planning and scaling up?
No, so usually this is, it's a deal between companies. And so IVI normally wouldn't.
If we end up having any actual vaccine for COVID-19, it's not going to be made by IVI, but rather you guys are providing that support function to the companies around the world to make sure that they can develop this. Why not just develop your own vaccine?
We thought that it would be enhancing for smaller companies to encourage them if we were able to be a fair broker. That is, we can support you by doing the tests that will allow you to know whether your vaccine is generating the right protective responses. So we could actually facilitate multiple companies' efforts using that approach.
At this point, if people think that if you happen to have any kind of personal financial interest in this thing, we can put that to rest.
No, I mean, the part of being a nonprofit international organization is that we are pretty closely monitored, and actually we put our financial reports, make them available. I mean, we're an international organization, we have to be transparent.
I suppose the biggest question that people have is why do we need a vaccine for COVID-19? How deadly is COVID-19 from every data points that you look at to date?
We have the actual crude mortality, so we know that, 2.3% of the people in Korea who got the infection died. And if you break that number down into age ranges, of course, actually the majority of people actually in Korea who got infected were younger. And they did relatively better. But once we get to the people who are 60, 70, and 80, we start to see mortality rates that are abysmally high. I mean, in Korea, 20 to 25%. In other parts of the world, the people who were older had mortality rates in the 70% range. And we benefited because most countries implemented some form of flattening of the curve. So our own success is causing people to doubt whether the epidemic is serious. It was success, I think many people will point out, was bought at an enormous cost economically. But let's not pretend that a disease that has infected 5 million people and killed now 300,000 is not a real problem. Even in the United States, again, the wealthiest country in the world with unbelievable health infrastructure. I mean, we saw hundreds, thousands die in New York City. I mean, we were in the same situation as Italy, another high-income country where they couldn't keep up with burials. For someone to say that that's not bad somehow, they need to talk to someone who's lost a loved one.
But it is still roughly 10 times more deadly than just a regular influenza.
Right. And so the idea that this is just the flu is wrong. I mean, when we look at aggregate mortality, all the deaths related to COVID that we can diagnose, it looks to be about 10 times more severe than the regular flu. We need to look at the numbers, and I think the numbers will bear out that this is a significant pandemic that is causing huge amounts of mortality, and that we're more likely than overdiagnosing it, we're probably underdiagnosing. Unfortunately, for instance, looking at the data from the United States, it's difficult to know how many tests are done because some states are not reporting that. So really, some states are complaining that they still don't have enough tests. So really, are people there dying of COVID, or are they dying of influenza or other forms of pneumonia? And we really don't know. But in the end, we have the data that we have, and when we look at Italy or France or Spain, or the United Kingdom, I don't think they're lying about their data. I think they're telling the truth, and the truth is dismal. I mean, we're seeing mortality rates in some European countries above 10%. But the reason that happens is because I think they're not able to get their arms around the big number, the number of actual cases.
Now that countries are starting to reopen their economies, Korea, as a matter of fact, started easing the social distancing, and then boom, So how does that change the prediction? How is this going to impact the infection rate?
Korea got to the point where it was under 50 infections for a long time, and then under 10 for a long time, and then the majority of infections were coming from people who had been in Europe or the United States and had come back. And so they waited, and when they finally got to that, the point where they finally released, I guess predictably, I mean, it was disappointing but not unexpected that you're going to see additional cases. The key was that as soon as that happened, the government was on top of it.
Can other countries do that? Are they capable of that?
So there is a report that Germany is scaling up its tracing teams. So I think it's possible, but it runs into the problem that Korea had planned to do all these things in the interval between 2015, when the MERS outbreak revealed that
Correct.
the system was not working optimally, to 2020. Other countries are trying to do it in the middle of the outbreak. I mean, not everyone can be like Korea. And I think they did 75,000 tests after the Itaewon outbreak.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah,
Just
to identify
after
the
the
200 or so people that were identified, they did 75,000 tests.
Okay, I didn't know about that. Yeah.
And many countries haven't performed that many tests in the entire outbreak.
Do you expect a lot more death, especially the states when they start reopening?
When they open. So I think many of us are hoping that doesn't happen. But they never got the number of infections down to the same level that Korea did. So we know that there are infections out there. The point of flattening the curve, well, there are multiple points, but one of the things was it gives you time to get masks and protective equipment and other things in place. It gives you time to train people to do contact tracing. It bought you time. It was temporizing. Did all the countries that implemented flattening the curve use the time wisely? That's going to be that is the the key question. So
What's your gut feeling when it comes to the States?
So in the States, I think they're going to have a difficult time because not all the states bought in, well, actually one state in particular didn't buy into flattening the curve. In a number of states, the number of infections was increasing as loosening was occurring. If you remove New York State from the rest of the aggregate figures for the United States, the number of new cases appeared to be increasing. But again, I think Dr. Birx has complained that she's not sure about the data. So is it really going up? Is it flat or going down? We have to look state by state because, I mean, the United States is actually like 50 different countries.
Let's say we do develop a vaccine, but when it comes to vaccination, because of some personal beliefs that stem from, conspiracy theories, that people just don't want to take them, what's going to happen in that case?
When we have a vaccine and it's shown to work and it's shown to be safe and, people have looked at the data and regulatory agencies have said, "Oh, we agree. We've been through every page of every document that you've generated," and in a vaccine trial, sometimes there's 100,000 pages of documents. "We agree. This is a great vaccine. Let's go. We approve this for marketing." Things may be different then, because then rather than multiple voices, there's one. It's a regulatory authority that is looking at information about protection against infection and disease.
I think that's what a reasonable person would do, listen to a credible source. But we live in a world, unfortunately, where people don't even take WHO seriously. Maybe because they, flip-flopped on their position wearing masks, or they're perceived to be affiliated with the Chinese. I don't know.
So I think what we know about the anti-vaxxer movements is that, by and large, I think a large majority of people are willing to take vaccines if they're known to be safe and effective. There's a group of people who are much more fixed in their belief that vaccines are dangerous, and they are very vocal.
Why do you think that is?
Problem is that sometimes beliefs like this are not amenable to what we would consider to be the facts. So there's going to be, and there is often, a group of people that are going to be unconvincible. But there's also a group of people who talk to them, who know them, who may have been influenced one way or the other, and it turns out that this group is slightly different. And with additional discussion and work by healthcare providers and others, they may see the benefit of vaccination. The message should go out: this vaccine is safe and effective. If you want to protect yourself and your family members, you need to use it. You need to receive it. We are vaccinating the elderly first. We're vaccinating healthcare providers first. We're doing these things in order to protect you so that you can come to the hospital without fear that your healthcare provider actually has COVID-19. And also to protect them because they're going to be, they are seeing people with COVID-19 infection, and we don't want them to be taken out of the game for 3 weeks because they're infected.
If that small minority of the population does not get the vaccine, that means, is it possible to still eradicate the virus? Because isn't that part of the reason why we still haven't fully gotten rid of polio, when in fact we are like 99-something% there?
Yeah, but it's possible within a country to do it. So the United States has managed to eradicate polio. It's managed to eradicate measles. So that eradication still counts, even though the outbreak last year we came in just, I think, under the wire. So we've managed to eradicate diseases from the United States. Congenital rubella, which is German measles, has an impact. It's actually a fairly mild disease unless you happen to be a pregnant woman, in which case it can cause birth defects. Well, we've managed to eliminate that through vaccination. So, we can eradicate diseases in countries with coverage of most of the population. So with measles, the coverage has to be higher, 95%. The hope is with COVID-19, it might be around between 60 and 70%, although again, we don't know. That's based on our best guess. So that even if you have 5% of the population doesn't want to get a vaccine, they may still be protected.
Is there any link, and this might be, I think, possibly the origin of some sort of like a theory about the negative or the dark side of vaccine. Is there any causal link between vaccines and autism?
No.
Where does that come from?
It comes from a former doctor named Andrew Wakefield. And he published a relationship between MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and autism in a very prestigious medical journal, actually, The Lancet. And it turns out that the data were actually not correct, and the paper was actually retracted by the journal. The Lancet actually said, we don't believe this, and got rid of it. But he's managed to create a following. He now lives, I think, in Texas, and has quite a large following. But as a result of that, there have been several studies, large studies since then, to look at this particular problem, and none of them have shown a relationship. So again, unfortunately, these things have a life of their own. And you know, anti-vaxxer movements go back to the beginning of vaccines. When they first started doing smallpox vaccines, so remember, smallpox is a disease that has now been eliminated by successful vaccination. But the smallpox vaccine, discovered by a doctor named Jenner, actually, in England, was actually a version of a cousin of the smallpox virus called cowpox. And cowpox came from cows. It was transmitted from the cows to the women who milked the cows, milkmaids. Oh. And it was found out, it was an observation, that milkmaids didn't get infected with smallpox. So they took some scrapings of cowpox and they inoculated somebody, and they showed that that person couldn't be infected. And this vaccination against smallpox was a remarkable find. It was so remarkable that it actually, in the middle of a war, it spread to the countries that were enemies of each other because it was considered to be such an advance. Napoleon issued these coins congratulating people for smallpox vaccination. Now, it's something that was developed by his enemy in England because it made such a big difference. Smallpox had a mortality rate of 30%. Wow. So, you know, the ability to use a relatively innocuous thing to prevent a disease with a 30% mortality was remarkable. And still, starting in the very beginning, there were people who were afraid that the injection of cowpox, you know, would cause all these negative effects, that you start to develop cow-like features, which we know didn't happen. The American Army actually had vaccinated people using an earlier version of a smallpox vaccine. And let's see, this story goes back a ways. So it was actually to use smallpox to prevent smallpox. It was actually something that developed, we think, in China, where they found that, you know, if you dried the smallpox, if you took the smallpox, the pus from a person with smallpox, and you took the clothes of a person with smallpox that had pus on it, you could actually have someone inhale that, and that small amount of smallpox that went into their nose would protect them against smallpox infection. And then they, you know, other people found other ways to do it rather than sniffing the clothes of people with smallpox. And that was to actually introduce small amounts of smallpox into an incision, into a cut that was made on the hand. And it was a huge advance. And the wife of a British diplomat in Turkey said, well, why is it that all the women in the harem of the Sultan have such beautiful complexions? Not a single person with smallpox. And she was told, well, there's this technique called variolation that introduces smallpox, and that prevents them from getting the real disease. And she got so excited about it, she had her children vaccinated, or variolated, and then she took the technique to England, and they started to use it. Well, an American found out about it, a guy named Cotton Mather, who was actually one of the, you know, that's a pretty big figure in colonial America. And he learned about it from an African servant. And he said, you know, this would be great. So he convinced someone in Boston to do it. Well, almost immediately, somebody in Boston threw a brick through his window with a note on it, you know, filled with expletives about, you know, how he was going to make everyone sick by using this technique. And it turns out that variolation, although it was associated, variolation, now remember, you're infecting someone with smallpox, right, which is the disease you want to protect against. Variolation had a mortality rate of about 2% compared to a mortality rate of 30%. So people took it up, and actually, although it was illegal, George Washington vaccinated his entire army, the Continental Army of the United States, over one winter outside of Philadelphia. And he did it because American soldiers weren't immune to smallpox. You know, America was relatively protected by the Atlantic Ocean. The British soldiers, on the other hand, had seen it and were protected against it. And so he was worried that his army would get smallpox. Remember, the American army at that time was pretty small and was getting beaten time and time again. And in the end, we got a safer vaccine, which was the cowpox vaccine for smallpox, and it eliminated a disease from the face of the earth. And that's the power of vaccines, right? Eliminates diseases. Polio's almost gone. This is the disease that crippled Franklin Delano Roosevelt, almost eliminated from the world. Smallpox, eliminated. It prevents cancer, prevents cervical cancer, it prevents liver cancers, hepatitis B vaccine does. So, vaccines do remarkable things. When you think about a vaccine, for every dollar that we spend on a vaccine, we save $16 in healthcare costs. And if you look at the total cost, so like the fact that parents can't go to work, and you save, for every dollar you spend on vaccines, you save $44 to society. There are very few things that give you a 44-to-1 return on investment, and vaccines are one of those things. So for a country, for an individual who is protected, for the society that they live in, vaccines do enormous good. So the CDC, US CDC, did a study looking from, I think, 1994 to 2013, so 20-year time span. In that time span, they think that the childhood vaccination programs that America conducts prevented, the number is 21 million hospitalizations, prevented 730,000 deaths. And some of those kids who are alive today because of vaccination are having kids of their own. So again, this is the amazing power of vaccination. The direct costs were over $300 billion saved to the US government, and the total costs, again, if you're looking at every benefit of vaccination in the US economy, it was $1.4 trillion of savings. Just the United States. So again, multiply this by, several orders for Europe and for Australia, for Japan, and you see the huge benefit to society from vaccination. Mm-hmm. And we don't think about that.
So just to be clear, what does cause autism then? Do you know?
I don't think we know that yet. Whether it's genetic, whether there are other environmental influences. We've looked very carefully to see whether vaccines do it, and they don't. A lot of people have looked at this, and because it's a major issue. We want our vaccines to be safe. And we hold vaccines to a very high standard of safety. Because, as opposed to, penicillin, which is given to people, with infections, vaccines are given to people who are healthy. And the goal is to keep them healthy. So if we find out, sometimes, we are using a vaccine and we find out that something happened. And we are really obligated then to make sure that vaccine, that we understand what happened, that we can show that somehow the vaccine was related or not related to it, because there's a lot of importance that vaccine developers place on the idea that their vaccines are safe and that they're actually protecting people against disease.
Microchips. One of the conspiracy theories about vaccines is that people believe that you can implant a microchip to either track your movement or somehow make you infertile. This is designed as a population control tool. Is there any basis for that?
For governments to do that, we're already having a discussion about even simple things like a tracking program, or the fact that the Korean government can access your GPS data because they've declared a national infectious disease emergency. Within the realm of science fiction, I would suppose that it could be possible, but again,
so as far as you're aware, that's not taking place as we speak.
So as a former Army person, it didn't happen in the Army, and there might be a reason to want to know where people are, if they get lost or captured, so again, I think we should be careful because so much that we've seen as science fiction has come true. Over time, being able to have like a Apple Watch that does what Dick Tracy's watch used to do. Really are remarkable advances in technology. We have to be careful not to confuse, the science that people talk about in the future and what we have access to today. And, I think at least part of the conspiracy theories are related to, what we think the government might have or what the government doesn't have. Something that went into microchipping and other, invasive techniques like that would not only have to pass regulatory review, but there would be a robust discussion in the parts of the US government that are responsible. I mean, not only the Congress, but in agencies that would have to use this over the appropriate use of technology. I mean, we have had huge arguments over privacy and medical records. And essentially what you're doing is creating a medical record. It's difficult to, if you needed to get medical records on your mother who happened to be in the hospital and you didn't have the correct authorization, it's difficult because we have laws, and that we've discussed these laws in relationship to what we need to know as healthcare providers, what family members should know about a family member who hasn't given consent. I mean, those are real discussions, and real discussions that can be buttressed by appropriate laws.
What are the chances of getting a COVID vaccine, let's say in 18 months' time or in 2 years' time, and the virus itself will have somehow mutated, therefore it's not as effective as you would hope?
Mm-hmm.
What are the possibilities of that happening?
So that is definitely a possibility. So you know that the flu vaccines change from year to year. The flu vaccine is interesting because there's a cycle between humans and birds that may involve pigs as well, and the viruses mutate, they exchange sections, and so we are prepared for flu virus variability, so every year the vaccine changes. The COVID-19 virus appears to mutate less frequently than the flu virus. Does that mean that a mutation that inactivates or that makes the vaccine useless won't occur? No, it doesn't. I think we're going to have to be careful to monitor the right animal populations for the emergence of new or potentially dangerous coronavirus species, strains. And we're just going to have to do a better job than we were doing before. And this will mean, as it does for flu, that we set up labs around the world that collect samples of coronavirus that we can look at and examine. And if there's a strain that looks different or different enough, then we may have to develop another vaccine. In general, though, we've been using rotavirus vaccine for a long time. We've been using other viral vaccines for HPV vaccine for a long time. Vaccines aren't like antibiotics. Resistance to a vaccine hardly ever occurs. And the flu virus is a little different because it does mutate itself and in this cycle involving animals and people. And we're aware of it and we track it. And because we don't know with the coronaviruses, I think we are going to be much more actively watching to see if other coronaviruses are emerging. I mean, it's interesting, right, that SARS-1 in 2002, MERS, actually from 2012, but in Korea in 2015, and now SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 are all coronaviruses. They have the potential to spread through human populations after contact with an animal. And I think the Chinese government, the US government, governments in Europe are going to be very actively engaged in research to look at these viruses and how they transition between humans and animals in order to predict and prevent the next outbreak.
Let's say it does mutate and we may have to develop a new vaccine. What I understand from the latest, the phase 1 trial by Moderna, is that it's the first RNA vaccine of its kind, whereas I understand that traditionally RNA vaccine is not like a usual thing. I suppose for the viewers, what is a RNA vaccine as opposed to DNA vaccine?
Okay, so I think, so if you remember back to your high school biology class, we call this the central dogma. So DNA, which is the genetic material, eventually has to be made into proteins. And the proteins are really important because they make muscle, but they also make things called enzymes that make all the other things that your body needs. And to get from DNA to protein requires a messenger, and that messenger is RNA. So when you're making a vaccine, you can use the protein, and we have protein vaccines that are protein only. You can use the RNA, and so you take the RNA and you inject it into a person, and that RNA that you've just injected makes the protein. Or you can use a DNA, which is then injected into a person, and that DNA has to make RNA, and then that RNA makes protein. And so you can use any of those potentially as a vaccine. There is not a licensed RNA vaccine.
I see.
There's no successful RNA vaccine that's been approved, for instance, by the US Food and Drug Administration or by the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea. There is no approved DNA vaccine either. We have approved protein vaccines.
So every vaccine we're taking is all protein vaccines,
No,
basically?
no, they're different kinds. So that's a great question. So there are several ways you can make a vaccine. If you imagine, let's use a virus as an example. You can take a virus and introduce it and in the laboratory weaken it. We call that an attenuated virus. And attenuated virus vaccines are very commonly used, and actually they're great vaccines because the immunity that you get to an attenuated vaccine tends to last a long time. So no boosters, in other words. So the measles vaccine is like that. And the original vaccines that were used for polio. I mean, you probably remember taking polio vaccine orally. And those are common. And if we can develop them, great. The problem is that they take a while to develop because you have to weaken the virus. And then you have to show that this weakened virus isn't going to cause the same disease as the old virus.
Exactly.
But if you get those vaccines, they really develop very strong immune responses that last a long time, which is what you want.
Without killing you, obviously.
Hopefully without making you sick. The next version would be to take those viruses that we grew up in the lab and kill it. Use heat or formalin or different kinds of alcohol to inactivate the virus. Ultraviolet radiation can be used to inactivate the virus. And you can inject that. And those vaccines tend to be pretty safe. The polio vaccine that we now get, actually we get in Korea and actually I got in the United States, were injectable. And they were killed virus that was injected. And again, those are safe. They're easy to make in large quantity and they tend to be cheaper. They're pretty simplistic, right? You grow the virus up, purify it, kill it, and inject it. It has this really kind of simple way, and two of the Chinese vaccines are whole-killed COVID-19 virus particles. Then you can get more complicated, and this would be the next generation of vaccines, where we could take a protein and make it in the lab, introduce it into something called a cell line, and the cell line essentially becomes a protein factory. Churns out protein, which we can then harvest, purify, and make into a vaccine. Those vaccines are great because they're, rather than have this whole virus with your body saying, do I want to respond to this club-like spike thing on the outside, or am I going to respond to one of the proteins inside the virus? What am I going to respond to? In this case, we give the body one choice. You respond to the protein that we're injecting. And so that has some advantages also. It takes a little longer to develop than one of the other vaccines or than a DNA or RNA vaccine, but it's a very commonly used molecular biology type vaccine. And then we had some vaccines that were developed primarily for bacteria. And bacteria have these complex sugars that wrap the outside. And we found that we could take the complex sugar and use it, but immune responses, protective responses, are not easily developed to some of those. So we started to link them to proteins, and we call those conjugates. And the conjugate vaccines are really incredible. The pneumonia vaccine is a conjugate vaccine, and it's an amazing vaccine. It's actually very complicated. The current version has 13 different strains of pneumonia included in it. But it works so well that it not only protects the kids we vaccinate, it protects their grandparents. Because the kids don't get the infections, but the grandparents don't get the infection. And now there are recommendations, for instance, in the United States to vaccinate the elderly as well. And so these conjugate vaccines have been a real advance as well. So Moderna has an RNA vaccine. There are no licensed RNA vaccines. But the beauty in Moderna's RNA vaccine is that it can be made very quick, from the time you start in the lab, the time you test it in animals, to the time you inject it into humans, can be short. From basically the beginning of January, where we first heard about this, the 17th of March, they did the first human vaccination.
That's really fast.
That's unbelievably fast. That's pushing the limits of what we used to speculate we could do theoretically, and it really was shown to be the case. And DNA vaccines are not far behind, right? So a month after that, Inovio did its first vaccination. Which one will be successful in the end? We don't know. Several of them now have been shown to protect monkeys, which think is very important. And the beauty of a COVID-19 vaccine is it will only protect against COVID-19. It won't protect against salmonella. It won't protect against rotavirus. When your body sees something and trains against COVID-19, that is what it's going to protect against. And that's the beauty, a vaccine protects against a particular pathogen, in this case, COVID-19.
So the whole point of getting a vaccine is so that it produces some sort of antigen, which then stimulates your own body to produce antibodies, right?
So the immune system is actually remarkably designed. Basically, circulating in your body are all the elements necessary to protect you against thousands of different germs, right? But you don't want them all turned on at once. In fact, the body says, why waste all the effort? Why waste the B cells? Why do all this if I don't need to do it? So the immune system evolved so that an antigen, say a COVID-19 virus, gets into a person, and the B cell and T cell that recognize it and eventually will attack it and destroy it actually are created specifically or have the sequences in them that will recognize COVID-19, but not rotavirus and not smallpox. And what the body then does is it takes those cells that recognize and react to it, and it amplifies them. It grows, it causes them to increase dramatically in number, so that in some infections, 8% of the white blood cells in your blood could be against the virus. Because when you see it, it's kind of like an alarm, right? The immune system says, oh my God, there's something bad here. The B cells and T cells and other cells that fight against infection go there, and then the immune response gets kicked off, and that immune response is going to be targeted only to COVID. It's not going to attack other things that aren't present. Why? Because you want the response to be tuned and tunable. And at the same time, a few of those cells branch off and enter a different pathway that we don't really understand well, called memory. And those memory B cells and T cells will hang around your body for decades. Because if you ever see that again, they'll be ready to come back quickly. So we call it the primary response. When you're first exposed to COVID, it could take, between 10 and 21 days to develop a really strong immune response. The next time you see it, the immune response is ready. It's trained. It's kind of like training a soldier, right? You might not be good at firing a rifle the first time, but after you've done it over and over and over again, you get pretty good. Well, the immune system is the same way. You see COVID-19 once, it takes a while to figure it out. You've got the response down. The next time you see it, the response comes back much more quickly, and it gets better. So with a standard organism like COVID-19, presumably the second time you're exposed, not only does the response come back faster, but the antibodies are better at binding to the virus. The antibody undergoes subtle changes, fine-tuning, that make them much more effective at targeting the virus. And that's, the beauty of the immune system is exactly that. It's inducible, it's tunable, and then it goes away when you don't need it.
Why do you do what you do? Because you seem so passionate.
I think IVI has a great mission. I mean, we know that there are diseases out there that are causing a lot of illness and death. In fact, I think someone did a tally once of the diseases that IVI works on. They kill 4 million people a year, every year. This is without COVID. This is pre-COVID. And if we could develop a vaccine against group A strep, or a vaccine against typhoid, or a vaccine against non-typhoidal salmonella, we would be preventing unnecessary death in hundreds of thousands of people. And we don't profit from it. We help companies manufacture the vaccines at high quality and affordable cost. In some of our programs, even in some of the programs that we're working on with countries like Fiji, we're really trying to show that vaccines can do a remarkable thing. And I find that inspirational. I get a lot of satisfaction out of our mission. And I think most of the people who work here, actually we did a staff survey, and they actually agreed. What makes them come to work? It's because they agree with the mission. Discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines. And that's what we do.
Then whose job is it to educate the public about the so-called efficacy of vaccines?
It should start at the top. And actually, a colleague of mine who used to be who worked for GSK told me a story that in South America, countries really believe in vaccination. And so there was actually a competition as to who would give the first dose of rotavirus vaccine in South America. Was it going to be the president of Venezuela or the president of Brazil? And they were vying to see who would give it first. And the solution was to let them both give it at the same time in different locations. But that's because countries recognize that vaccines are the most cost-effective way to prevent diseases. So if at the top there is that kind of enthusiasm and support for vaccination, if that is relayed through ministries of health, through doctors and nurses and teachers, then support for vaccination as a societal good can be accomplished. And when and if we have a COVID vaccine, I hope that from the top of government, through the people who are giving vaccinations, through teachers and people who are influential in the community and on the internet, that we will get the idea that these vaccines are safe and effective, and that really, if you want to protect yourself and you want to protect others, then you'll take the vaccine.
I suppose it goes without saying that the leaders who make the decisions at the top have to make informed science-based decisions.
Right.
Not a political decision.
Right. Looking at the data and looking at the science rather than trying to do but at that level, politics always intersects. But it's hopefully going to be a politics of consensus rather than division around the efficacy and the safety and the benefit to the people of the country.
I think what you do is very important, and I think it's important for people to know the truth, not science fiction. And so, thank you for your time again, and we hope to see you soon again.
Right, thank you.